Good evening. Good evening and welcome. Thank you all so very much for being here with this early 6 p.m. Start. I think we are going to have a series of what I'm sure will be wonderful and provocative presentations and discussions on the topic of waste. I must own up to the fact that really the origins of this idea go back to the person who's not with us here tonight. So I feel, in a sense, it's with a little bit of regret that Frank Gehry is unable to join us for very legitimate personal reasons, but hopefully he'll be here soon, perhaps in the fall, where we can follow up on some of these conversations. I think about a year and a half ago, visiting Frank Gehry at his office and talking about various things, one of the things that came up was really how strongly he felt about the issue of waste as something that really is one of the key topics that faces, for him, contemporary architectural practice today. I think by that he didn't mean the use of the word waste in the more usual sense that we associate, for example, with garbage, though that is a very important part of it, but more the concept of not wasting, not being wasteful. At least that's what I understood by the way that he was discussing it. Of course, the issue itself, operates at multiple scales and has all sorts of repercussions, both in terms of new buildings, landscapes, concepts of recycling, and so on. But I think this specific sense of the idea of how design creativity, how design ingenuity can provide certain solutions to contemporary design practice that can really avoid waste is a key component of this work. At first glance, I think the work of Frank Gehry isn't really the icon of not wasting, because his work, in a way, is an architecture of exuberance. It's the idea of doing a lot of things. And I think this exuberance is also associated with a certain level of excess, of having things that are, go beyond, for example, the concepts of existence minimum or doing very little or minimalism. But at the same time, how is an architect like that, like Gehry, given this sort of belief in the exuberance of architecture, also reconciles his work with this concept of waste. Of course, we also know from so much of the work that he has contributed towards, and really the role of, for example, Gehry Technologies, that part and parcel of the way that Frank has been operating is also a way in which technologies, specifically certain kinds of computational procedures, are intervening in the relationship between design and building technology to try and find alternative ways in which the realization of the architectural project, the concept of variegation, of variety, of multiplicity, can also have certain localized rationalities. Historically, when we think about this idea of industrial production, we think about seriality, the production of the same thing in many ways, and then utilizing standardized elements, as opposed to the idea of elements of architecture, each one of them being unique, also being produced. So in some sense, I think what this concept of waste also refers to is, in some ways, instead of repetition, is the customization of uniqueness as one of the possibilities. If we also compare, for example, the the Disney concert hall to something like the bird's nest of Herzog and de Meuron. We also see in the bird's nest there is a certain element of waste or wastefulness which is at play, where there is an excess of structure. So, and this excessive structure is also part of what provides the effectual conditions, the affects of the architecture, through the fact that there are multiple layers of structure. And this, I think, also touches on the question or the degree to which the concept of ornament, in some ways, the multiplicity of structure adds to that. So this, I think, raises the question, is there a balance? Is there a moment at which this idea of waste, we can talk about it in terms of the relationship between representation, ornament, and wastefulness? Or is the idea of waste, that is the redundancy that exists in something like the Bird's Nest project, at the very core of architectural production, that the production of architecture is in some ways also the production of redundancy and the production of waste. This, I think, also raises certain issues then in terms of, is there an aesthetic of waste? Is there an architecture that becomes the architecture that grows out of waste? And I think there are certain histories and traditions to this. So finally, probably the question is, how does this issue affect both the production, the making of design, but also its reception, the way in which we make judgments about our design projects? And when I talk about architecture, I really mean seeing my friends from landscape architecture here. It really means landscape architecture, urban planning, urban design, all of those things that are design. I think the two panels that we have are here to help us think through some of these questions and lots of other questions related to issues of recycling and so on beyond those. The first panel, in a way, deals probably with a larger scale set of issues, broadly speaking, even though I don't think there is a sort of singular consistency in that argument. And the second panel focuses more specifically on the making of things at the smaller scale. And I think we're also very lucky and happy that one of the things that we will focus on is actually food and cooking and making things, which is still part of the creative process, the same way that design thinking is part of the design process. To help us with the two panels, we have two wonderful moderators too. The first panel will be moderated by Professor Ed Eigen, who's an associate professor in the departments of landscape architecture and architecture. And Ed's work focuses on the cultural dimension of landscape and architectural history through consideration of topics such as cultural geography and cultural studies. He is currently working on a book-length manuscript on accident, which is also a collection of essays that is studying the contingent and highly localized conditions for the production of knowledge around science and nature. And the second panel will be moderated by Andrew Witt, who knows more than anyone else about Gehry Technologies. He's a faculty member here at the GSD, and he is at this point based in LA and is the director of research at Gehry Technologies. He was previously the director of Gehry Technologies in Paris, where he was also very much involved with, for example, the LVMH cultural project there. He's worked with Atelier Jean Nouvel, with UN Studio, with Co-op Hemoblo, and was actually trained here at the GSD. So we were lucky to have him here, and we are lucky to have him back. So without any further delay, please welcome Professor Ed Eigen, who will then introduce our speakers.
Good evening, everyone. I just wanted to thank the Dean for including me in what I have every expectation will be a very productive evening of discussion. and introduce the speakers by way of this suggestion that so vast is the question of waste that it is difficult to know where to begin. So I will begin with the question of the beginning, or the waste that preceded it, which is to say creation, which was itself a matter of waste removal. And one doesn't have to proceed beyond the second line of one important strain of Western creation ideas, and I'm referring to the book of Genesis, as it's known, or Bereshit, the book of creation. Here, line 2, chapter 1. When God began to create the heaven and earth, and the earth was then a welter and waste, tohu v'bohu. It's the beguiling hendiadys, this matched pair, a welter and waste, and darkness over the deep, and God's breath hovering over the waters. God said, "Let there be light." Then there was creation. It is, as I said, a vast topic. And I say vast because the word waste has the word vast in it. And we speak of wastelands or vastnesses or wildernesses as places that are or once have been uninhabitable. This term comes up in Rania's talk, and I'll introduce her in just one second, where she speaks of one of these accounting errors we've taken upon ourselves within our modern industrial rationality. She says, urbanism has rested on the city's capacity to divest itself of environmental costs by externalizing them to the scales of the region and territory, what David Harvey refers to as an externality field, what I would call, again, wasteland or vastness. So what I want to do is, as I said, introduce our speakers, less so by way of biography, because you have their biographies have been printed and consulted, but a bit more to do with geography, which is to say another type of writing, or to say their writings on the earth and the question of waste and wasting that are before us. And to highlight in those introductions very briefly some of the problems of terms and terminology, given my own literary, if not literal-minded bent, and what words we choose. The dean suggested it might not be trash or garbage we're talking about. What is waste? Is it waste, trash, as Alan Berger suggests dross, in a very important intervention in our field, as Hanif suggests, a problem of slovenliness, what I would perhaps call phthisis, or the Greek wasting disease that is so common in our vocabulary. So finally, what to call it, either in the nominative, the accusative, or dative, which is to say to whom it belongs and where it should be placed, and whether it's properly a thing in itself. So first of all, for our first speaker tonight will be Rania Ghosn, and her she'll be speaking on the geographies of trash. To use that term, geography again, the description of the earth. Rania is an architect and a geographer and assistant professor at the University of Michigan. She is founding partner of Design Earth. That's the name of a firm, a collaborative practice with El Hadi Jazairi. And if you really are designing the earth, I hope you have at least one collaborator. Her work critically frames urbanism at the intersection of politics, aesthetics, and technological systems, but be they energistic, having to do with energy, trash, or farming. Rania, as many of you know, holds a Doctor of Design from the Harvard Graduate School of Design, which is to say she's one of our own. So we welcome her back this evening. Hanif Kara will be speaking, another of our faculty members will be speaking this evening on engineering waste under the subtitle Naive Acceptance or Bias Rejection. Hanif Kara is a practicing structural engineer and professor in practice of architectural technology here at the GSD. He's the design director and co-founder of AKT II, which is the firm Adams Kara Taylor, which pursues a design-led approach to innovative form and complex analysis methods. And I just wanted to draw your attention to a comment Hanif made in another GSD-related publication under the title Interdisciplinary Design, New Lessons from Architecture and Engineering, where he discusses the notion of built projects as instruments, and refers to George Orwell's essay of Politics in English Language of 1946, which has to do with the politics of clarity, of transparency, of speaking of things as they are, or to borrow a phrase from Erasmus of Rotterdam's Adagia, calling a spade a spade. In this essay, which holds to the the practice, the political force of describing things as such has often been juxtaposed to Theodore Adorno's essay of 10 years later, Punctuation Marks, where he held that lucidity, objectivity, and concise precision are merely ideologies invented by editors and writers for their own accommodation, which is to say what happens when we gloss over the facts or make them difficult, and whether that's productive or not. And I would suggest the question here is what to call waste, especially in a presumably precision-based discipline such as engineering, and precisely in its encounter with architecture, which invites all sorts of joyous excess. Our third speaker this evening is Alan Berger, and his talk is under the title First Thousand Hectares, African Agribusiness Cities. Alan Berger is a professor of landscape architecture and urban design at the trade school down the road. Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where I took my degree. He's the founding director of PREX Lab, head of the CDD, the City Design and Development Group in the Department of Urban Studies and Planning, and research director of CAU MIT Center for Advanced Urbanism. And these two phrases from his own biography online. All of his research, all of my research, emphasizes the link between urbanization and consumption of natural resources, which is a compelling statement to have a coherent body of one's work around this central and conspicuously important theme. And secondly is this note that appears in the biography where he says he coined the term systemic design. And here I just want to go again from biography to geography, or the question of writing, of describing, of knowing things in the world, what it means to introduce something like systemic design, or the notion of, say, dross into our vocabulary, and how it forces us to think anew about our practices and, as Hanif would say, our attitudes about the world about us.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for the kind invitation. It's a pleasure to be here and share the work that Al-Hadi, Jazari, and myself have done within the umbrella of Design Earth on Geographies of Trash. So a couple of words on Design Earth, which assumes some of the agency that the name carries. So it's concerned with the relationship between geography and design. It's a representational and speculative practice, which by making things formal and visible, counters aesthetic and political abstractions of space. The practice of geographing, as we've kind of began that collaboration here at the GSD within the umbrella of New Geographies, actually. That practice involves both writing about the world, conveying, expressing, or representing it, and writing on the earth by making, shaping, or transforming it. And it's within this umbrella that Geographies of Trash has been pursued. August 1966, Life magazine published Planet Earth by Dawn's Early Light, a photo essay for the Gemini 10 shuttle. Capturing the Earth from the most remote perspective to date, the series of photographs concluded with an image of a small floating figure in silhouette, a single trash bag suspended hundreds of miles above the surface of the planet. The plastic bag contained the objects that NASA intended to leave behind before the mission's return flight to Earth. An image only one can wish has permeated the environmentalist imagery as much as its contemporary blue marble has ever since. Similar material politics were underway on Earth. In 1987, the Mobro 4000 infamously hauled 3,000 tons of trash from New York to Belize and back until it was finally incinerated in Brooklyn and the ash buried where it originated. Burn it, bury it, recycle it, or send it on a Caribbean cruise. These are the four things Ed Koch, former mayor of New York City, said could be done with the garbage. This mediagenic incident was emblematic of a garbage crisis in American cities, which equated the significance of space to the availability of waste disposal sites. In these contexts, trash comes to be referred to as a matter out of place, what anthropologist Mary Douglas designates as dirt, the response to which is to remove it from domains of occupation and relegate it to sites of containment. Such externalized space, the extraterrestrial in the first image, and the offshore in this second one serve to reaffirm the purity of what remains outside of it, the urban in this case, and the broader earth in the first one. Indeed, clean urbanism, as Ed kindly noted in his introduction, has rested on the city's capacity to divest itself of the environmental costs brought rapidly by an expanding consumer culture, by ejecting them into the scales of the region and the territory, what is referred to as an externalities field. The research responds to a set of provocations. What are the geographies of such unaccounted for spaces or urban externalities? Can the representation of dimensions, forms, relationships of trash systems assert the agency of design beyond moments of crisis and positivist management practices? If the abstraction of space conceals the social, political, ecological imperatives of trash system, can the geographic, as a scale and aesthetic, reinscribe such technologies within public and disciplinary imaginaries? So we conducted this research within the framework of research on the city at the University of Michigan. And to pitch a project on the city, one which had a broader territorial significance, we kind of put together a very quantitative diagram, whereby if all 79 active Michigan landfills were added together, it would make up for a city-sized issue, nearly the size of a township, similar in scale to Ann Arbor. However, the disposal of trash in the periphery of counties and townships surrounded by major highways below a green sanitary cap and next to disfavored populations makes landfills barely noticeable to urban centers and urban discourse. So we played the game, and the rule was simple. Follow the trash bag across scales of containment, from the domestic trash bin to the transfer station, the landfill, across county regulations, state tipping fees, and North American trade agreements. We looked in detail at the 14 active landfills in the Detroit metro area. So in this case, waste is strictly waste, municipal solid waste, managed by the different county administrations. So the region currently has 14 active type 2 and type 3 landfills accepting waste. Most of them, as you note in these diagrams, actually occupy the border of the counties within which they're located. So a certain kind of pushing to the limit, but also many of these county lines actually correspond to major road networks. So the project Geographies of Trash spatializes the representation of these systems to propose 5 strategies of waste disposal for the American territorial grid. So the projects that I'll share all occur within a 1 mile square area, and kind of that standard dimensions that they occupy help an imaginary locate them in their specific sites, but also allow them to travel to other possible geographies. The 5 projects are cap, collect, contain, preserve, and form. So as I said, they're both situated in their specific sites, but they think of them as also potentially traveling. They each also take on a parameter that we've identified of these trash systems and operationalizes design as a way to speak back to such constructions. So you'll see soon how that works. CAP formalizes the metrics of landfilling operations into a geographic monument. Currently, landfills are hidden or naturalized under a green carpet at the periphery. So the first project explores alternative forms and symbols for waste disposal sites. CAP rationalizes the process of landfilling, that of cell construction, material stacking, truck circulation, airspace, which is the volume of space of a landfill that is permitted for the disposal of municipal solid waste. So it looks within the operative logics of the industry itself. And rather than a dull green carpet, the proposal gives shape to a ziggurat of trash cells, one which actually in itself can help to optimize the circulation and disposal of these trash systems, but also it culminates the 20-mile automotive Mound Road corridor, which is this area which is flanked on both sides by major industrial site. And as such, the monument serves as a marker of many of the decentralizing and wasteful forces of Detroit's urbanization. By giving form to the landfill, CAP reclaims as such both a site and an object for the urban imaginary. Second project, collect. Recycling programs are in the hands of vertically integrated companies who make money twice in the process, out of charging the thrower for collection fees and then selling the recycled materials. The project asked whether we can utilize the economic value of recycling to mobilize social capital and social space in the shrinking city. So Collect localizes the surplus value of recycling out of the monopoly of vertically integrated corporations and within the scale of the neighborhood. It converts the Russell Woods Neighborhood Park into a ground for the collection, sorting, and redistribution of solid waste. Away from a consumer-scavenger binary, the current binary that structures our relationships or our subjectivities with respect to waste, the system of trash serves as a ground for the construction of new subjectivities in which the neighborhood waste economy becomes the locus of a collective project. Contain integrates waste management technologies into forms of building construction and urban interface at the scale of the block. So trash is currently hauled over long distances, usually to distance undesired costs or externalities from more affluent to less privileged areas. Contain asks whether we can productively limit the flows of waste. Can we imagine a scale of trash management, one that actually yields positive values and that does not involve displacing them across county, state, or national boundaries? So Contain internalizes composting and burning within the courtyard of perimeter building types. The enclave constructs itself from the waste it manages. Byproducts of low-tech composting constitute the soft surfaces of semi-public interior zones within the block, which are lawns, fields, or gardens. And the bottom ash of high-tech burning is used as aggregate in the construction of harder surfaces for the perimeter housing blocks. So matters such as pavement, concrete, or concrete stone. Eventually, the future city makes less distinction between cycles of supply and cycles of waste. Preserve. Currently, a very low permeability synthetic membrane is used for trash bags and landfill liners, so at both scales, at the domestic scale and at the territorial scale. Can we imagine alternative ecologies for the landfill? Ones that do not depend on the plastic wrapping of all material, but rather favors the dumping of biodegradable material. And in doing that, shifts some of the liability in the industry away from the recycler in sorting trash and more towards the industrial operators that are involved in the production. So the project inserts a landfill into a golf course, which is itself an Indian Springs Nature's Preserved at the extent of Detroit's outer city. So the suburbs of Detroit, actually differently from the image of the shrinking cities, hold some of the richest zip codes in the country. So such landscapes of lush golf courses are not very far from the more famous 8 Mile line. So by doing that, it actually plays the artificiality of these different processes one against the other. So the different images of nature that a landfill, a golf course, and a nature preserve carry amongst themselves. And it proposes to curate these multiple ecologies. So if in this case, it actually inserts itself in an existing natural reserve, it could potentially, it proposes that this might be a strategy which is not in relation to the existing large preserved land, which makes the northern part of the state, start to operate as a preserve logic that can start to populate the southern half. So the landfill sites which start to host around themselves new nature preserves. And within this site, the landfill liner is replaced by decomposition strategies, whereby trash becomes part of the preserve's ecologies and the new animals that are housed on it. Practices which were very much part of urban life until the systematization and the corporatization of trash system. So very familiar scenes with respect to the presence of further biological lives using our waste as part of their own resource systems. So against these, some of the visions of landfills that actually think of them as post-termination strategies, or the necessity to think about them 30 years down the line, we actually think that the operating landfill itself should be thought of as a site of intervention and as a political ecological issue in itself. So these projects come together in one installation: cap, contain, preserve, and form, and collect into 1 meter cube feet structure. So if the externalization of waste depoliticizes it as matter out of place and renders it as a non-issue, then the proposal to inquire into the geographies of trash brings the space of management into the domain of controversy. The challenge, however, is not only to render visible the inequality between a distribution of space and a distribution of power. Above all, the challenge, literally, that of writing the surface of the earth, elicits us to intervene within power and its representations in ways that make a difference. So we propose that the geographic offers that way of thinking about containment itself, that surface liner or that edge, as the ethical site by reconfiguring the aesthetic, economic, and programmatic structures upon which the boundaries of these systems depend. Form-making, design in this process becomes a political tool which disturbs the consensus of urban managerialism, or the idea of as long as it's not broken, don't fix it, to actually reclaim matter into objects of design and politics. Thank you.
Good evening. Thanks for the invitation, Mohsen. It's nice to be back, almost. I want to mention one thing related to my introduction that may or may not have anything to do with trade schools. I normally get interrogated after I lecture, so I'm not quite accustomed to being interrogated at the beginning, but I appreciate the effort to start things rolling, and I'm sure there'll be some more later, no doubt on the panel piece of this. What I want to talk about in this lecture, it's a very brief lecture. I want to talk about a project that we're currently working on. It's brand new. It hasn't been discussed in public yet, and it's really so new that we just finished it yesterday, the first pass at this. And it is a project that is in Ghana, in West Africa. Now, anyone in the audience that knows me knows that I don't normally spend my time in Africa. I'm kind of a Club Med guy, so when I have time off, I don't get in coach and fly for 17 hours. So to get me to go to Africa was a challenge, but actually what I discovered once I got there was a really fascinating set of issues. And so I'm a little bit invested at this point. I think we've also now spread into Congo. And so this is the first piece. We're actually working in 2 countries now in Africa. The question that I want to raise related to waste, I've covered waste for a long time. I kind of spent a lot of time with waste. In fact, waste has sort of been my best ally because I made a career out of waste in many, many different forms. Without waste, I probably wouldn't be here. And when I normally talk about waste, I talk about the kind of waste that is obviously a physical entity, right? Trash, the kind of materiality that's left over. But I also talk about it in terms of entropy and efficiencies and inefficiencies. And so this project really kind of touches on all of these things, and I would say there's 2 elements to this project that probably never really get raised. And I'm imagining my experience when I was here at the GSD don't get raised so much in this environment, certainly get raised all the time down at MIT, which are the concept really of human waste, human capital waste, and what do we do about that, and where's design's role in dealing with that. And I would say the second one is looking at large government kind of funded projects and nonprofit sort of structured huge projects and saying, where's the waste in words? Where's the waste in text? Where's the materiality that comes out of policy that we can extract some value out of? So this is the topic, and I would say starting with this is probably appropriate because the last time I was in this room, I was at a review for one of the core studios, and I saw a lot of urban farms. It was a landscape studio. And I would just like to posit tonight while I'm here to say that we're spending way too much time on urban agriculture as a field, landscape architecture is, and I think we're really missing the big opportunity, which is to figure out on the food front where design can intervene in large-scale industrial commodity trade. No one's really gone into that realm yet other than as a mapping exercise. So this project touches really on some of those big issues. I've been studying the large-scale stuff for a while, photographing, chronicling, documenting it, and ultimately will become a production when I have some time to do it. So the project I want to talk about is a really big one. It's being organized by the Center for Advanced Urbanism, of which I play a leadership role. There are multiple other organizations and groups involved in this project, and it's sort of the idea that if you're going to farm in Africa, what comes out of it? If you're going to farm somewhere in the world where you're going to move a global commodity around, what's a design enterprise? What's the urban result? What are the urbanization issues? How do you structure a new form of the city? All these things come together in this project. We don't have all the answers yet, but these are some of the players we're dealing with. Obviously, PREX Lab is my lab. My other main partner on this is Alexander DeHuga from Org. He's also a faculty member at MIT and runs a center with me. And then we have great partners that we're working with in Africa who run profit and nonprofit organizations. This is a site. The site is located in the Afram Plains. It's a very fertile area. There's going to be an enormous amount of agriculture that's built here. The Chinese are all over the place building infrastructure to offload the material and ship it all over the place. Although I don't think actually they have a big stake in the food. I think they actually were sent over there with a $300 million fund so that the Chinese government could put their workers to do something to keep themselves busy. And I think that's really what's going on here because there's no stake in the farms. So they're building some infrastructure. The site is right adjacent to Lake Volta, which is the largest freshwater reservoir in the world. There's a huge abundance of water available. And what I will show you in the next slide, which is a little bit concerning is, well, not this slide, but it'll be coming. There's literally no infrastructure connecting the site. There's no roads. To get anything out, you have to send a barge from Accra or Temi, the nearest port that's all the way across the reservoir. And the concept essentially is this, is that it's a new concept, Agribusiness City. It's built around these two, on the bottom of the slide, these two organizations. One is Africa Atlantic. It's a for-profit company that's run by a guy named Issa Balouk, who's one of our sponsors for research, who was also a senior fellow at Harvard's Kennedy School's Leadership Institute initiative. And he's a logistics guy, and he's been working in Africa a long time. On the nonprofit side is the African Agribusiness Knowledge Centers, which says, what do you do with the human capital that comes out of for-profit farming? And so when you take these two things together, their concept essentially is this, is if they need it for a profit farm, then they need it, the people who live here. Meaning, if you're going to do what all the massive organizations, the World Bank, African Development Bank, Rockefeller Foundation, Ford Foundation, you go all the way down to Gates Foundation. If you do what they do, they dump money on the problem, and they hope the problem gets resolved. There's thick policy that goes with the problem, and there's no one there to watch over it. There's no for-profit entity that has a stake in it. And many of these projects have failed. There's been an enormous waste of tens of hundreds of millions of dollars in the billions now. Huge waste. And so what we're trying to structure here is a for-profit, nonprofit entity that says, if you're going to do a farm for export, who runs it? The people who live here or move here that have a stake, the Africans who live here. And they will be trained, they will have a transfer of knowledge, and they will be trained to run the farms. The farms will make their profit. The nonprofit side will vertically integrate knowledge into the population and new people that come to the site. And that will be knowledge that's not wasted. And it will build an economy, will build a lower, essentially a lower end middle class, basically an African suburb condition. It's not gonna be a big city in places like this, and just won't be big cities. About 30,000 people in a kind of suburban settlement that run these operations. And what we've been asked to do is think about vertical integration, obviously. The waste issue, you have to use everything. There's nowhere you can store things. There's nowhere that you can actually waste things. You should, in a place like this, you have to reuse everything. And so we're looking at about 80,000 metric tons of corn, which translates, after half of it gets exported, for the for-profit farm. Half of it stays in the country for domestic use, food security issues. There's still enough to feed 4.8 million people chicken or protein if you rotate the crop, if you rotate the yields in to a vertically integrated system and build those facilities on the site. And so we've been asked to deal with this. Again, here's the infrastructural dilemma. There are no connections here. Who are going to build these connections? Luckily, we have a logistics guy who's running the for-profit side who knows a lot about logistics. But, one guy's not going to pay for 10 miles of superhighway connections to run trucks. And so it's a much larger question. We've looked at this for them, and there's probably multiple ways it will get solved. There'll probably be a small airport to bring most likely corporate people in who have investments in this place who have to spend a day to get here. And there'll also be, we need a refrigerated line, so there'll be all kinds of things that move chicken and protein around. And most of the grain will probably be taken out through barge to other parts, and mostly in Europe. This is what's there now. The proof of concept is the first 1,000-hectare program. They have 2 years of yields. They have a huge pivot irrigator that they brought in. They pump water from the lake, and they've had 2 crops. It's successful. The proof of concept is the thing that typically the big nonprofits never do, so they fail. What they've been able to do here is prove that they can actually grow with minimal inputs. And so the result is they've attracted a lot of potential funders from both the public sector and also the private sector. This is what it looks like. So it's hard to imagine a city here, right? It's hard to imagine even a suburb here. People live in these kinds of mud huts, 5 per hut on average. There's 2,300 people on 10 square miles. There's 19 villages. Most of them are along the lake and rely on fishing for food and commerce, food for trade that they pull out of the lake. And by the way, they also dump their solid waste directly into the lake from their huts and drink the same water. So this is an interesting exercise. We went there and did a design charrette for villagers who had never seen a satellite image, didn't even know where their village was in context. We did a one-day charrette under some tents, met the overlords and chiefs who have allowed Africa Atlantic to lease this land for 50 years. And then the next day we were at Stanford Seed Lab in Accra, and we ran a similar session for high-level funders. And so you can imagine what that's like, one day followed by the next. Everyone from Unilever to major foundations are in the room on the right. What we discovered was when we did the charrette out on the farm, we asked people to implant onto a list what they needed. What do you need? If we're going to design something here, what do you need? And a lot of them said trucks. We need a truck to drive around on these dirt roads. We need a clinic because a lot of our kids are sick. And that was pretty much it. And I said, what about electricity? What about fresh water? And they started to live. Their desires were not long-term. They were real short-term. And so we started thinking about long-term issues. I'm not going to really talk about the master plan. I want to talk about the landscape pieces that we worked on. This is the site plan. It's a long build-out. The first piece, the Knowledge Center District, is under construction right now. It's right where the number 1 is, next to the big letter A. That's the landing zone. It's got 4 districts. The industrial district is D, and we separate it from the housing blocks. And you see all the way up at the top at B is more like farming, sustenance, housing, where land title will actually be given to people who work on the farm so they can actually own land, which they don't do right now. And also structuring the place on a 60-meter grid prevents what we believe will be a massive influx of informal housing. And so part of it's defensive. And so we're trying to structure it this way. These are landscape pieces I'll talk about very briefly. Now, why am I talking about the landscape pieces? This is a 30,000 person city. It's a pretty big area. It's about 10 square miles. What does landscape have to do with this? And so I just want to make a point to say that we were given the task, the brutal task of reading the International Finance Corporation's requirements for funding on cities like this, on projects like this, big farms. And what we did is we read it looking for opportunities for landscape. We read it looking for waste, essentially. Where are there missing value systems? Where are the gaps not being, the gaps meaning the design opportunities not being discerned by these government agencies and these nonprofits? They don't talk about design. They don't make any room for design. So you have to read into the document, find a place for it, and argue it up through the system. And so the landscape operates basically as a structure to build design into the mechanisms of requirements to apply for funding from the International Finance Corporation. And the elements are very straightforward. One, soil conservation. If you don't have soil conservation program on your farm, you cannot apply for funding. And we're talking tens of millions of dollars here. So one of the first things we did is we built a system of berms, spines that prevent the runoff from these enormous pivot irrigators to prevent the soil from leaving. It's very thin soil, and it's high in iron, so we don't want it entering the lake. These strips double up also to deal with the deforestation issue, which is another policy program there. If you can deal with deforestation, you also can apply for funding on a number of different mechanisms. And those two things are combined here, where we take the area between the circles, use the extra water that's there anyway, and apply it to growing crops, tree crops that can be then harvested by local villagers and sold at market. Take the dependence away from fishing in the polluted lake. And the alternating system is the swale, and the swale alternates with the berm, and the swale is where you find other kinds of tree crops that need the gradients of moisture and connect riparian zones together. So when you start looking at all these things together, there's an enormous amount of leverage funding that can be had for design. You just have to look between the regulatory mechanisms. This is another piece that also goes back to the 50-year lease agreement with the chiefs, which was that if you're going to build this big corn crop, that you're going to take area away from farmers that live there now. And so you have to provide a higher level of farmland for them near their villages. And so what we have here is a buffer crop zone for the villagers, the actual villagers to use, that's irrigated, and it's paid for by the for-profit side. So again, we're using the extra fertilizer, runoff, and water. And this is one of the more fun components for landscape architects and others to look at, and they love this idea, is the football field filters. So when we start building the impervious surfaces, by the way, there are no impervious surfaces out here right now, and we start adding them and calculating what the runoff is. There's a water conservation requirement of IFC as well. And the way we deal with that is we structure these football fields, which was one of the top things next to trucks that the villagers wanted. And the football fields have swales along the side, they have gaping structures. They actually filter some of the things that are going on, but they also provide a recreational resource next to the riparian corridors. And this was, I would say, of all the elements, the top, this was the winner. This is the one everyone wanted to build first. And so while the Knowledge Center is going in first, I'm working on the football filter first, and they're going to go in unison. The build out looks like this. Over time, you can see the swales and the berms go one after the next all the way up as it builds out. We put this housing in first because those are the first guys that are going to work on the farm. The knowledge will be transferred to them. The Knowledge Center campus itself will go in very early. There's be 2 buildings in here, and then it will grow out as we get more crop in. And the Knowledge Center will attract not only people that come from the outside to invest, but it's also attracted the likes of many really big industrial corporations that want to have a piece of Africa. Of course, we've structured this, and our clients have structured this in a way where no one gets any exclusive rights. It's been another big problem in Africa, is giving exclusive rights away for long periods of time, and it's decimated these opportunities. So this one's very carefully done not to do that. And it looks like this over time. I'm not responsible for the big box architecture. I'm responsible for the landscape components. And we put this thing back in place, deforestation, water and soil conservation, using the requirements that are not written into the policy, but finding opportunities in the policy to deal with the natural waste that's going to come out of this place, but also trying to think about the larger ecology of the lake, the future of the human capital here, the human waste, and recycling that knowledge back into this as it builds out. And I would say probably more than any of these is finding opportunity where so many other projects have failed miserably. And that's the Agribusiness City project. Thank you.
I'd like to thank our speakers for those very compelling and provocative interventions. And I thought I'd just make one or two brief attempts at consolidating the comments and then turn it over directly to our audience because in the interest of time. There was a comment that Rani made that struck me with her Geographies project, which was this phrase or refrain, follow the trash bag in a sense, which gave her a marker, a way to investigate certain processes and the kind of dismaying fiction of the trash bag being a succinct and discretized object in this vast field or flows of trash. And taking that observation to the talks overall, what struck me was the concern expressed throughout with practices and forms of knowledge and the waste that is built into them, for example. And so Hanif's talk, I was extremely struck by your idea of recalibrating factors of safety or the possibilities that are realized through the recalibration of factors of safety, which I take to be the result of new forms of calculation and precision, allow us to redeploy existing building systems and rethink practices of the engineer and with regard, say, to the architect or existing architecture. Alan, in your talk, the idea again of wasting or preserving human capital, human knowledge and its deployment. And what I was interested in your talk is that ecology of agencies and agents and actors in this field and how the practices, the learning procedures might redescribe these types of interventions. So I guess what I'm getting at, perhaps we can address as an opening idea is how our own practices involve issues of waste and where we might find possibilities for optimization or unrealized dividends, if you will. Yeah, you can begin, please.
Well, I guess I would say that, everyone has a different practice, so it's difficult to make an overarching statement about how everyone should deal with waste. I would say that the way that we've dealt with waste in the past is really, one of the vessels or mechanisms that landscape architecture has been using over the last 10 years is a slightly different form of data than maybe engineers use, which is the tool and representational tool of mapping as a discursive, iterative communication tool, meaning that to visualize the invisible, make visible the things that people normally wouldn't see through whether it is normative market processes or just the notion of something being disvalued, nobody looks at it, things that are discarded, things that have no value are able to be visualized now because we have such amazing tools to collect data with and then represent them to make them much more apparent to all the rest of us, and then we can act on that medium, we can act on that biomass or that thing. And so I would say that if there's a general way that we deal with this now, it's through representation, making visible what normally would not be visible by measuring it and drawing it and giving value to what was previously had no value or somebody left over because they couldn't give value to it. We're great at that. I think landscape architects are really good at that, whether it's because we mean to do it or because we have it as a survival mechanism. That's probably for each of you to decide. But that's how we've done it, chronicling things that people have really missed through normative market action. and rendering them visible for other people to act on. I don't think that I should tell anyone else how to act on waste, but I'm happy to represent it and share it with everyone so that all of you can figure out ways to act on it yourselves. That's always been what I've said in all of my work. I only there's one way to do it.
So much of the interest in the project is actually looking at the business of waste management. It's your trash bag is actually someone else's dollars. They see value in the process, and it opens up a broader set of questions on value regimes, or how do we see value in things? How do you extend the life of things into the domains of value? Recycling operations have found a way. So in a sense, it poses the question of value, but it also looks at the different economic and political structures that make out of it a possible commodity. So Michigan, for example, is the second state, I think, after Pennsylvania in importing waste. So we're not actually looking at the management of local externalities. It's not even that. It's actually a lucrative business to get into waste management. So I would say part of the interest in this project is this system in particular somehow, but also broadly the question of urban systems and what values are embedded in the making of literally boundaries. And this is why I think we go back to the question of the very symbolic dimension that the trash bag plays in this respect, which is it clearly delineates within this black or green plastic matter what is it that you do not want from the domestic domain. And the fact that once you translate that to the scale of the territory, it's also, again, another big trash bag that holds that. So the possibility or the dream of perpetuating that outside, that's something that allows you to maintain what is dear in terms of clean or pure. So I think it's, and this is the operative value of some of these projects, is to actually allow a discussion on some of the assumptions and structures that underpin the operation of these regimes, to open up some of these discussions, many of which have been in operation for much longer interest, but almost a way of thinking about some of the embedded terms of value, of symbolism, of civicness or urbanity, in as far as they relate to particularly the system of municipal solid waste.
I would relate more to, because I am talking about another level of precision in everything I talked about. It's a kind of a forensic look, so making the visible invisible, the invisible visible is probably what I would relate to if your question is about how do we change the practice of what we do in academia, but also the practice of what we're doing in practice, so to speak. I would say that the only thing I would add to that and repeat my last slide, which would be the question of time, because the biggest waste inevitably in whatever you do is very, very directly related to time. So ways of finding how we reduce that, but also ways of putting handcuffs on those who are making the visible, the invisible visible, in a way that they want you to read it. So there is a lot of data, big data, being portrayed and photoshopped, in a sense. So I think there is an opportunity to get to some of the truths now, because we can actually model and look back at things that were said even 20 years ago to see if it's the truth.
Yeah, I mean, to use your term, which I think is extremely apt, the idea of forensics, what I see is continuous these three talks is some form of forensic accountancy, holding agents or things to account, or making visible invisible loss or seepage or friction or what have you, and tending to costs which aren't often figured into the system. I think that's a very useful phrase. Should I? Yeah, maybe I'll open it up to our gallery. Antoine, please.
Which is slightly a provocation, but I was very much struck by the kind of formal choices you made in both projects, which is a kind of return to a certain form of modernity. And it reminded me almost in the way neoclassicism tried to have strong forms, very strong forms to counter, the possible dilution of modern flows, etc. So I was wondering, is that a conscious choice? In your case, I was almost reminded of Le Corbusier agricultural village, because he did actually design agricultural villages. So there is this very strong, modernist or neo-modernist background. And, we heard a lot of critique of Valmont informal, the messy network-like, etc. So if you had a comment about that.
I mean, I guess I could say something on that. I can assure you that in our discussions, I can assure you the word modernism was never a part of any discussion on this project. But I will say that, having worked on many projects similar to this in a historical context, the knowledge of these previous projects, some successful, some not, all the way from Broadacre City down to Corbusier and other projects, we do know what has been successful and what hasn't been successful as a model. And so maybe I would say that some of the elements that have, formalistically speaking, maybe it's the grid, maybe it's the 60 meter plots they're big enough to farm, and we have one house on it. Those probably leak in from fascist era kinds of projects that dealt with sustenance housing or post-World War II sustenance housing, but those were not consciously imported from other design typologies. They were more than likely brought in because they performed a certain way based on historical precedents. So I would say that's probably what happened. There was one discussion, though, I think that you might appreciate, which was in the Knowledge Center, the long green alley that had development on both sides of it. And there was one moment where the form of the Knowledge Center as the first piece and what that would look like did come up, and it was a heated discussion about whether we wanted to do that kind of a layout, of which my response was, I don't really care what it looks like. I just don't care. I was caring more how it would perform. I would say that the architect who was on our team cared much more about the issues that you're describing. So the performance I can live with, and then maybe that's part of the issue. The performance I know would be high, and so the form was secondary concern for me and was adjusted by somebody else.
On the provocation, so I would say there's maybe a modernist in disguise that recognizes the modernism of these projects. I mean, we kind of, it's definitely a prominently figuring tradition, along with the pyramid as a protagonist, along with some of Boulet's visionary 18th century. But I would say it's partially, we could say it's an aesthetic preference and leave it there, and partially tie it to the project of the modernization of the city and the control of its systems of flows. One which at the moment of embedding or these systems in infrastructure starts to recuperate some of them as domains of operation for architecture. So form, I can say that it was consciously provocative or form making in this as a way of engaging some of these discussions to allow them to happen. Usually the pyramid is the one that becomes the most iconic or controversial immediately as this symbol of burial, but at the same time a very present monument in the city, and it's the main entryway. It might be an unfinished project in many ways also, which is a side project, not necessarily the kind of the matter of this of these interventions.
Well, since the idea of containment came up as a theme, I must very regrettably say that I need to end the discussion here because we have a very packed evening and we want to proceed to the second panel. I've just been told by Chantal that the plan is in fact to move directly on. So whilst you were promised to break, forget about it. So stay seated. We have the second panel about to begin. And I wanted to thank our presenters for wonderful interventions.
Right. So our second panel, I think, deals perhaps more directly with this intersection between the systemic and the artifactual. Our panelists operate on a diverse range of scales and practices, yet they share a certain investment in excavating the cultural implications of product and byproduct. Here's a re-examination of this tacit distinction and a suggestion that points of inflection along a spectrum, points of inflection along a spectrum from one to the other can lead to a making which is at once more frugal and more rich. And beyond the imperatives of economy and ethics, our panelists see the human possibilities of beauty and wonder in the recharacterization and recasting of waste in new roles. So ultimately, there's a grappling with the public engagement with that very material presence of waste, as I think you'll see in a few of these projects. So in these projects, we also find our relationship to product and byproduct as alive and ongoing, not something static or merely binary, but a schema itself to be recycled, reconstituted, and done with ingenuity, opportunity, and imagination. So we have three panelists, three distinguished panelists. Our first panelist is Nick Anderer. He is the he's the executive chef and partner in Maialino. And after his background is actually in art history, so be very informed on some of the issues that we're talking about from a cultural point of view, from Colombia. And he started working in New York under Larry Forgione, who's known from An American Place, Rose Hill, Manhattan Prime, and Mario Batali at Babbo. And he also cooked at a number of kitchens in Rome and Milan. And after his time in Italy, he landed at Gramercy Tavern, where he worked for 6 years. Firstly as a sous chef, and then later as executive sous chef, to his current chef and partner, Michael Anthony. So in 2009, Nick was named executive chef for the opening of Maialino, where he later became managing partner. And his second Italian-themed restaurant will open in this summer at King Grove Hotel in New York. In the interest of time, maybe I'll just introduce the panelists collectively. So our second panelist is Caroline O'Donnell, founder of CODA, an experimental design and research studio operating at a range of scales from urban to architectural. O'Donnell is currently the Richard Meyer Assistant Professor at Cornell University. She has previously taught at Cooper Union, Manchester School of Architecture, and TU Delft. And of course, her work has been exhibited widely and internationally. She's also a prolific writer. She's contributed to Thresholds, Log, and was one of the founding directors of Pigeon Magazine. Is currently editor-in-chief at the Cornell Journal of Architecture. And then finally, we have, anchoring the evening, we have Iñaki Abalos, our chair of the architecture department at the GSD. He studied at the Architecture School of Madrid, where he took both his professional degree and PhD. And he's been a visiting professor at Columbia, the AA, EPFL, Princeton, Cornell, and of course is the Jean Labatut and Kenzo Tange professor here at the GSD. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Nick.
I think we have a short video to start things off. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me here today. This is a real privilege to be in front of you guys and talk to you a little bit about what I do. Hopefully I haven't offended too many people with that video. But it is a good representation of what we do at Maialino, and I figure it's best to attack the subject right at the head, and so you see the stuff that we're working with, and as you'll hear from what I'm about to talk about, really that prima materia, which is the stuff that we call that, you know, the prime materials that we're working with, which is the food, the ingredients, are the thing that really keep me motivated, that keep me, you know, driven in the kitchen. You need to be very driven. So let me give you a little just history on how this restaurant came to be, because I think it's sort of, you know, it ties a lot of things together. As you heard, I studied art history at Columbia, and so I had the great privilege of being able to take a study abroad program where we got to walk 3 hours a day through the city of Rome with a group of professors, and we were studying everything, but mainly architecture. I was into Borromini at the time and was studying a lot of urban planning, but I found that on a daily basis I would get distracted as I walked through the city of Rome by food. I had the great privilege of working with a professor, Franco Camis, who was really great at finding a way through these 3-hour walking tours of always bringing the subject back to food somehow. And you know, we'd be walking through the Forum Boarium, which is famous for being the first gladiatorial site in Rome. The first fight that ever took place between two gladiators was in the Forum Boarium, but she somehow made it known through her discussion of ancient temples and architecture that, hey, you know, this site is also the place where, come the 15th century, it turned into the place where all of the cattle would come in off of the Tiber River and would be butchered and distributed. And then that was sort of the things that kept piquing my interest. So while people were looking at the mouth of truth that was right across the street from the Forum Boarium, I was interested in hearing more about how those cows came to be, where they're coming from, and figuring out where that food culture stemmed from. And of course, every day after these 3-hour walking tours, we would be famished, and she had a great way of finding places where 15 students, American students, can eat in Rome. And it was those kinds of experiences that kept making me think, I got to find a way to get back to the city in a more food-related way. So in some way, my sort of development as a chef has always been sort of like a journey back to Rome, trying to figure out a way to get back there. I came back to the city. I worked for a lot of great chefs. I worked for one guy in particular. His name is Mitsuo Kikuchi, who has since disappeared off the face of the planet. So if any of you guys know him, let me know where he is. But he was the chef at a place called the Water Club, which was a you know, not so great restaurant, admittedly speaking, in the East River. It's still there. Great for weddings and things like that, but I sort of, you know, that's where I made my bones. I learned, you know, just chopping onions, peeling carrots, and doing god-awful tasks that, you know, nobody ever really wants to do for the rest of their life. But it gave me a respect for ingredients. It gave me respect for hard work. And what this guy Mitsuo Kikuchi did is he was the guy that would develop all the fish specials every single day. So although there was an executive chef in place who would make pretty much the entire menu and design it for his staff, this guy Mitsu would be in the back, you know, creating all the fish specials, which was really the big money maker at that restaurant. And he had a great way of butchering fish where he took 2 knives and he never touched it with his hands. He would literally take 2 knives, put the fish right down on the table, and never touch it with his hands. And then you'd have on one side the fillets, on the other side the bones, and nothing ever went to waste. And so he taught me 2 really important lessons. And he said, you know, basically, whatever you pursue, his English was really bad too, but he was able to convey to me, he said, whatever avenue you pursue in food, whether it's restaurants, whether it's catering, just always make sure you respect the ingredient. And the other thing he taught me is that no matter how hard I ever practice, my knife skills will never be as good as his were. And that much is true. They never got that good. But I focused on other things. I got a chance to work with Mario Batali, as you heard, and working there finally afforded me the chance to get back to Italy. I didn't get back to Rome, but after working at Babbo, I found a way to just, you know, sort of con somebody into thinking that they needed an American chef in the middle of Milan. I figured it was close enough, you know, other side of the country, but still in Italy. And so when I went out there, I just kept finding a way to get back to Rome. I kept going back to that city, visiting. There was something calling me back. So eventually, when I came back to the city, to New York City, that is, I started working with Danny Meyer, and you guys know who Danny Meyer is, right? Show of hands, no? Somebody? Danny Meyer owns many different restaurants in New York City. I started working for one called Gramercy Tavern, and at Gramercy Tavern, I had the opportunity to talk to him about his past and how he got into restaurants and how he sort of viewed the ideas of food and ingredients, and it, coincidentally enough, his experiences also went back to Rome. He had done an art history program many, many years prior, and it was actually the exact same art history program that I had done. So we got to talking, and he said, Nick, would you like to open a Roman-style restaurant in the middle of New York City? And I was like, wow, this is too good to be true, of course. All right, let's do this. And so then finally I found a way to get back to Rome. The reason I bring this up is I think there's a connection between what I discovered in Rome and kind of what a lot of people have been talking about tonight, about the ideas of just responsible usage of resources. And in my particular case, it was food. There was a neighborhood in Rome called Testaccio, there still is, which I kept finding every single time I would go back, and this was before I even became a chef. As I was a student, I discovered there's so many restaurants in this neighborhood that I thought they did tremendous food, and it was like a neighborhood that you wouldn't go to just to sort of walk around and sightsee. It's not a very pretty neighborhood. It's very residential, pretty ugly, to be honest with you. And the restaurants themselves are pretty ugly. I think my wife's sitting here. She's been to a couple of these restaurants with me, and she can attest to the fact that there's not a pretty restaurant anywhere in the neighborhood. What actually first drew me to that neighborhood was, this sort of like a nightclub scene and late night bars. And as a student, not some of my proudest moments were had in that neighborhood, but that's kind of like the area where if you were in Rome and you were looking for, the guys, the authentic Roman version of the Jersey Shore dudes, they'd be hanging out in Testaccio. So that's how I first got introduced to the neighborhood. But then I kept discovering there's this rich food culture aside from this really cheesy nightclub scene. And when I went back to start researching for the restaurant, I realized that neighborhood was also the home to the macelleria, which was the slaughterhouse in Rome, where everything, it was basically the more modern day Forumboarium, which is, now the macelleria is gone, but up until the beginning of, to the 1920s, that's where every piece of cattle, pig would enter the city and then get broken down and distributed throughout. And then what ended up happening is that all the butchers of the area lived in this one little neighborhood right by the macelleria, and they didn't make a lot of money. And most of the noble cuts of all these animals would be going towards clergy, nobility, and really what was left behind, the head, the tail, the cheeks, all those sorts of things, and the innards were the stuff that was really part of their compensation. And so there was a type of cuisine that was born out of that. Out of this sort of like poverty and innovation of these butchers, because they knew how to cook, that was called the Quinto Quarto, which basically means the fifth quarter. The fifth quarter mathematically is referring to the fact that if you take the weight of the animal, all of those innards and the offcuts represent 1/4 of that animal's weight. It also refers to the fact that there are 4 noble quarters of an animal, none of which these guys got to take home, so they took home that 5th quarter. So this obviously got me really excited. I was like, wow, now I'm learning something about Rome. I'm going to take this back to New York. And I think that what we discovered when we started diving into this is that, we really wanted to be chef archivists. We wanted to be the guys that would sort of, because there's a lot of Italian food, across the U.S., but particularly in New York City. You can imagine the competition level's high. If there's an Italian dish out there, chances are somebody's done it. So what I wanted to do is I didn't want to reinvent the wheel. I don't want to say, okay, we're going to do the next new inventive Milanese cuisine or the next new inventive Sicilian cuisine. We wanted to do something that was inspired by Rome, but was really archiving old recipes and doing it the way that we thought was really the right way. And didn't necessarily mean doing it the traditional way, because we were in New York City after all, and we weren't going to be able to get all the same ingredients. But we wanted to make sure that everything that we cooked, everything we created was sort of through that looking glass of the way that those butchers in Testaccio would attack, in the case of this video, a pig. But really anything, vegetables. When we go to the supermarket nowadays, I think that you'll go around and you can attest to the fact that, you'll see maybe some nice radishes, maybe some not so nice radishes, but where are the greens? The fennel, where are the tops of those fennels? A lot of this stuff you don't know where it goes, right? So we wanted to make sure that no matter what it was that we were doing in our kitchen, we were finding the best possible ingredients from the best possible people that were growing these ingredients and then putting them to good use. So we were basically wanting to recreate a Rome that didn't even really exist, because I think that what I discovered, I had a very romantic vision of what Rome was from sort of my days as a student and then my days as sort of like becoming a chef and figuring out what it is I wanted to cook. When I went back to actually research for this Roman-inspired restaurant, and sort of like we were out there for 2 weeks right before the opening of the restaurant, just checking out, making sure, checking our recipe lists and tasting things like 10, 12 times. I had so many carbonaras I couldn't even count. And what I was discovering is that there was a lot of crappy food out there, and I was really disillusioned by the fact that, wow, it's like, where has the craft of cooking gone? Even here in Rome, it's like, I thought this is like the motherland, and it really wasn't. There was a loss of that craft even in the city where it had originated, and so what we really wanted to do is sort of like give a rebirth of really doing things the right way. And I know that's a kind of a bold statement, like, yeah, we're the chefs that do things the right way. I mean, there's plenty of chefs that are doing things tremendously, especially in New York City. But what I mean by the right way is actually going back and doing things in a way that doesn't show any wasted motion. I think that there's so many restaurants and so many chefs out there, unfortunately, that are very talented that like to create based on an idea. And the idea is not really where I think the menu starts. The menu starts with sort of like a responsibility. You buy a pig, whether or not you have a good idea for the pig or not. Maybe you have one good idea for that pig, but one good idea is not going to take that pig and put it onto 300 plates and use the entire thing. So what we discovered is that we need to, as a team, and it is a team sport. I mean, cooking is nothing that I create alone or that any chef creates alone. We go back into the kitchen, and there's a whole slew of us that are sitting around, batting ideas back and forth and saying, okay, but all those ideas are driven by the stuff that you have on the table in front of you. So we might commit to a side of steer, an entire, half of a cow, and we're like, holy crap, what are we going to do? It's like, there's no way that we're going to sell this in a day or two. So we started coming up with some innovative ways, I think, at least, to attack the problem. And one of the things that really helps us out is science. I mean, I think that the whole idea of molecular gastronomy gets a really bad rap in the kitchen nowadays, but it has done a tremendous amount for us in our kitchen in terms of the ways in which we can, buy from responsible farmers who, for the most part, have to sell in large cuts. They can't break down. They don't have the resources to fabricate and give you 20 tenderloins in a week. And if it were the ideal world for them, they would be able to grow cows that were just basically walking tenderloins of beef that didn't have any other parts. But that's not the way it is. So, you have to buy whole cows. And so we figured out ways in which to both preserve and also to make more flavorful some parts of these animals that maybe were less prized. One of the techniques that we use is sous vide cooking, and I think maybe some of you have heard about it, but essentially what it is you take a piece of meat or vegetable and you throw it inside of a cryovac bag, and you do that for a couple of reasons. One of them might be because you have bought an entire cow, and you're only going to use the tenderloin today. What are you going to do with the other 300 pounds of it? So you cryovac it, and it preserves it. Another thing you can do with that it does for you is, in the example of chickens, which we sell a lot of at Maialino, is you take your chickens, you season them, you put them in the cryovac bag, and they sit in that bag overnight, and through compression osmosis, it becomes more flavorful overnight. You then cook it in a water bath at a specific temperature, because one of the biggest sins of a chicken is when they get overcooked and dry and rubbery, and everybody's had that experience. We make sure that nobody has that experience at Maialino. We cook them at a water bath temp so that it comes exactly to the right temperature. So therefore, when we are ready during service, we can take that chicken and basically take what has been would have otherwise been like a 35-minute cooking time and made it 6 minutes. And that's really important to us because we want to be able to produce not only a fast product, not a fast food product, but a fast product in the sense that we can get it out the kitchen, but also a very consistent product, and all the while supporting the farmers that we want to support. Because the alternative would be, okay, so if we don't have sous vide, then we're going to have to buy chickens 6 days a week, 5 days a week from a less responsible resource, from some large meat purveyor that's getting their chickens from who knows where. And that's something we try to avoid. So, technology has really helped us out in the kitchen quite a bit. I remember too, like working for great restaurants back before I was working at Maialino, where without this kind of technology, even 10 years ago, I would see things happen that really frightened me. I was like, okay, so we have 12 rabbits come in, and all the offals, all the offcuts, the livers and the kidneys, which chefs tend to fetishize over. But there's a good reason why chefs, I think, fetishize over the offals, because I think they're driven by using everything. I think that good chefs and responsible, consumers nowadays need to be thinking about where is the rest of that animal. And so one of the big reasons why I came here to talk about the Quinto Quarto is because I think a large part of what that cuisine is all about is making sure that you don't neglect that other stuff. And if you really force yourself to do it, you can make some pretty delicious things out of that other stuff. And so what I noticed at a lot of the restaurants that I worked at is that all this other stuff was either getting discarded or spoiling. And I wanted to make sure that we did not end up becoming like one of those restaurants. I wanted to make sure we used that stuff and we made it delicious. I mean, after all, this whole conversation of, waste and using and making sure that you're have economy of motion, it's all well and good unless you're actually, but if you're not producing something great on the other end, then what's the point? So for us as chefs, we're in the pleasure business. We want to give pleasure. If I can't make this stuff delicious, if my farmer's giving me a chicken that is not great, then what's the point if he's raising the chicken the right way? So, but what I discovered over the years is that there is a direct correlation in the farming industry and in the cooking industry that if you do things the right way, if you grow the chicken the right way, if you treat them humanely, it actually ends up being a more delicious product. And that's something that, as a naive young cook, I didn't quite understand. But over time, you figure that out. There's a big difference between a chicken that was raised the right way and a chicken that wasn't, and we could tell the difference in taste. So that was a big sort of movement for us at Maialino. The whole idea of local is also an interesting one because I think people talk a lot now about being a farm-to-table restaurant and sourcing locally and making sure that everybody knows it comes into your restaurant that the ingredients on this dish came from 50 miles away and nothing was more than 100 miles away. And I think to us, it's a complicated issue because local is not everything for me. I think that the idea of local more conceptually as a relationship that you have with your purveyors and a relationship you have with the growers and the people that are providing your ingredients means something. But I'm not the guy that's going to stand in front of a group of guests and preach to them about my chicken named Fred and his parents and how good they were. That's not the platform I want to stand on. I think that what's important to me is that yes, we know the person who I got it from. I can talk to them. I can call them if there's issues. If something wrong happened with the delivery, I know why it happened. And I think that that's an important distinction. I think that restaurants nowadays are getting a little too preachy about where their stuff is coming from, writing it down on the menu. It's like if I did that, I would be lying every single day because I'm getting stuff from different people on different days because available. That's Mother Nature. That's the way it works. And so I'd rather stand on the platform of come to Maialino because there's delicious food and because just trust that we're doing it the right way. If you want to know some more about it, then ask me and I'll tell you more. And I think that I'm going to also be the last person to say that I'm the farthest thing from a food snob. I mean, I enjoy McDonald's. I go home and I cook instant ramen. So I don't ever want to give anybody the impression that what we do is in any way a religion or a must-do kind of thing. But it's all about just moving that needle of perception and moving that needle of awareness for people, so that people actually ask the questions, so people and the right questions. They understand, the intricacies of what goes into really cooking good food. And then when it comes to making the menus, it's a very, very complicated thing, and I alluded to it at the beginning about how we attack this on a daily basis. But it really is a sort of a game between sort of putting together pieces of a puzzle with a team and figuring out really, what we do at the restaurant is basically a fancy way of treating leftovers. We do grandma food, essentially. We want to cook stuff that looks as though nothing had happened to it, but as a matter of fact, a lot of things happened to it, right? So that sous vide chicken I was talking about, it should just look like grandma served you roast chicken, but in fact, there was a lot of really cool, technological savvy stuff that was happening to that chicken, but we don't want you to see it. And I think that, there's so many ways in which, we decide these things in the restaurant, and I think that the most important thing that we do as a team is that we keep that dialogue alive between the chefs and between our purveyors. And I think without that conversation, without talking to our purveyors, without talking to our chefs, the good ideas don't ever come to be. And so these menus are not created in a vacuum. I think all the ideas that we come up with at the restaurant, a chef will come and we play these games every day. One of them is called Bottom 3, where we take 3 items from the day before and we say, okay, everybody here has to pick 3 items that they absolutely do not like, and you can't not choose. I mean, even if there were 3 dishes that you liked, find 3 things you didn't like about them. And we do that on a daily basis, and I think that it's very negative in one way because you're forcing people to find mistakes. But I think without doing that, the menu doesn't stay fresh, and the restaurant doesn't get any better. Great ideas come from some of these chefs that I work with too. I mean, we've had the opportunity to build an amazing roof garden on the top of this. Right now, Maialino sits on the ground floor of an 18-story building, which is the Gramercy Park Hotel. And someday somebody came and said, "What's going on in that roof? Why is there, all this trash sitting around and nobody's taking care of it?" So we went up there one day, and one of my great sous chefs at the time, his name is Dan Dilworth, had the bright idea to start building some stuff. And he had no engineering background whatsoever, but he saw some potential. And so he started picking up old wood planks and plastic cases, lids from Lexans, and started laying down soil beds. And then he started collecting rainwater from on a regular basis and put in a sub pump, and it had an irrigation system for all these beds. And then we took all these stock pots from down in the basement that were getting thrown out. We made flower beds out of those and started growing rhubarb and strawberries. And the whole idea was like each week, another sous chef would come with a different idea about what we wanted to grow, what we wanted to do up there. And the idea wasn't that we were going to save the world with a roof garden, but it was just that we could take all of this stuff and all the resources that we had as a team and create something so that we wouldn't necessarily supply 100% of our menu with what was up there, but we would certainly use 100% of what was in our four walls of the building. And that was something we forced ourselves to do, and it was a really tremendous exercise in sort of, not wasting movements. So I think that, something that's been commonly said between all of us is that, there is a tremendous challenge in front of us. Food is I think a small fraction of what we really need to be thinking about when we're thinking about waste, but it's an important one. It's certainly important to me. We're in a tremendously competitive business, and I think that we like to compete with each other on a regular basis, even internally at Maialino, so that we can keep this conversation alive. And so on a regular basis, those menus that you're holding, the Quinto QuartoNicholas menus, are something that we look back to for inspiration, because we say to ourselves, hey, how would they have done it, these butchers done it, if they got forced to the situation? And you have to think, working at Maialino, our situation is not that bad. We have a lot of resources at our fingertips, and we have a responsibility to think about how they did it and try to do it the same way.
So it seems like Nicholas and I have a lot in common. There's no pork at all in my presentation, but we do both use the term offcuts. And I notice at the end of his menu there is a dish called CODA. So thank you for that. My name's Caroline O'Donnell, and my office is CODA. And I'm going to talk tonight about Party Wall. Party Wall is the winner of a competition, the Young Architects program run by PS1 MoMA every year. They have had 15 now, they're in their 15th year. And the brief has always been very simple. It is, they ask for shade, water, and seating for a huge dance party that happens every Saturday. And they also mention something about sustainability, recycling, and reuse, although we never know how seriously to take those terms, I think, today. So our idea was, given that this is a temporary structure, it lasts for 2.5 months in the summer, to use this basic recycling loop that we all know from primary school, and just to elongate it, to stretch it a little bit, and to borrow some of the materials that are already in circulation, use them for this project, and then give them back to that loop. So before we even met with PS1 MoMA to discuss the terms of the project, we kind of had already seen this brief, so we thought we knew what we were doing. We decided to walk around all of the recycling plants in New York, which just happened to be in the vicinity of the PS1 site, which is circled here. Most of the recycling plants that we visited were very organized. This is not one of them. The problem, though, that we encountered with those very organized sites was that people who ran those plants were very reluctant to talk to us at all, certainly reluctant to sell us at any price the recycled or in the process of being recycled products that they had. So they had products like this, super exciting things, everything, including the kitchen sink, metal wires, motherboards, hubcaps, lots of exciting stuff. And we were told over and over, no way, presumably for liability reasons, if you get injured by any of this stuff, if you get cut, there are issues. So absolutely no, you cannot use these materials. The only possibility were some of the centers that were a lot looser, and this is one of those, loose in a lot of ways. But in those cases, it was very difficult to guarantee any kind of material continuity. We didn't know if we could get enough of whatever material it would be that we wanted. Luckily, while we walked from plant to plant, we also passed a lot of kind of fabrication manufacturing shops and saw lots of kind of offcuts on the street that were mistakes basically made by these companies. My favorite of which was the elevator cab company, whose number of apertures obviously depended on the number of floors that the elevator was for and the kind of changing light patterns that came from that. What we also saw on that 2-day walking trip were these kind of proliferation of signs and billboards in Long Island City, and the particular type of billboard, which where the background is kind of dissolved and this filigree structure remains to be seen. And this is actually the view from the roof of PS1, where these billboards are kind of like wildebeest grazing along the horizon. And also the very nearby context across the street of, this is 5 Points, which up until last summer actually was this kind of graffiti mecca. It's no longer the case. So when we finally met with MoMA PS1, they did give us the brief that we were expecting, but they also kind of menacingly slipped this other brief across the table, which was basically everything else that wasn't on the previous brief, and they were kind of in opposition to each other. So whereas the first brief asked to make as much space as possible for a huge dance party for 7,000 people in one Saturday, the second brief said, what about all of the other days of the week? What about a lecture? What about a movie screening? What about some sort of music performance? And we thought maybe if these two things that seem like they're impossible to work together, maybe if we can make those work, we might win the competition. So we knew we had to make some sort of Jekyll and Hyde situation, but maybe a friendlier version of that, thus the pink. So to cut a long story short, the project we proposed was party wall using the architectural meaning of the word, a shared wall between different parties. So if we could satisfy these, the dancers on a Saturday, but also satisfy the people who wanted to sit on chairs and watch a lecture, for example, that might kind of allow all of these different parties who were vying against each other seemingly to be satisfied. So these are some of the initial conceptual designs. So the short story is you take a canopy, rotate it 90 degrees, you create a vertical shade as long as it's oriented correctly in relation to the sun. You cut away at the feet to touch the ground lightly, as was the requirement for the dance party. You think of this thing as a stage set where there's kind of a series of stages meandering around the feet of this animal, a water connection to what should have been a church courtyard and a kind of baptismal font at the hinge point, cutting away at the top to create an urban sign in a kind of dialogue with these other signs in the neighborhood, pulling out at the feet for stability, inhabiting those feet with a series of pools, and then finally, which should be the focus of this talk, skin shedding. Just to say the idea, let's say the conceptual idea of the skin shedding comes from a previous project that we did called Bloodline, Self-Consuming Grill Pavilion, which takes a kind of geometric cube clad in grill holz, which is a German word for barbecue wood. And then through the use of this pavilion over one summer, this interior form gets revealed. So this is a kind of exploded diagram of one of the facades and a portion of that we built in Ithaca, where you can see, and I think this is the important point, that the architecture doesn't necessarily exist in one state. It exists in two oppositional states and a range of moments between those. And I think thinking about this kind of possibility of change and not really, the project never being complete until the user becomes engaged in the project, allowed us to think about that possibility for Party Wall. In our case, we thought what would maybe make the project work is allowing chairs to be the focus, where this thing, let's call it an animal, to keep the continuity going, could kind of suck in its skin when the dance party was on and become as small as possible. And then when a lecture happened or a fashion show or whatever, the sedum could kind of be released into the courtyard, and both of those two states could happen at the same time. We looked at lots of chairs. Emiko is the first chair, very expensive. We asked them to donate chairs, wasn't happening. We looked at very cheap foldable chairs, and a favorite of ours was the Pantone chair, which had beautiful kind of scallop effects. But basically, it's important to mention that this competition has, or this pavilion has a very, very low budget. So the cheaper chairs that we looked at, the cheaper the chairs got, the worse they got environmentally. You can imagine your standard white patio chair. These chairs are neither recycled plastic or are they recyclable plastic in the future. And so we kind of went back to the drawing board, desperately searching for chair-like objects. And we went to the Cornell Materials Research Lab, who listed about 50 exciting new products. And one of the things that they mentioned was Comet Skateboards, which is a local company in Ithaca where we're based, who make eco-friendly skateboards, and their byproduct, or their offcut, is this. So it's a double-pressed, heat-pressed, sustainably forested maple board, a series of laminates, that is then CNC milled with the form of the skateboard cut out. And we thought, okay, we just need to add some legs, and we have a chair or a kind of bench. Obviously, there are issues with this bench, but we thought we'll press on. I think we were really convinced when we started to look at the various weave patterns. So obviously the scale of this object, this is a 4-foot long board. The scale of the object is kind of too large, let's say, aesthetically, and we started to look at various weave patterns between these boards, a kind of a third ratio and just weaving the ends together. And I think when we made this mock-up, which is the simplest kind of weave, it's a half weave overlaid, so you shift one board across and shift one up. I think this was pretty convincing to us, especially the way that the light came through that, and looking at it in the detail where you start to see the curvature of the board assisting in that weave. Luckily, we discovered in talking to Comet that this wasn't their only waste product. Let's see if I have a pointer here. So you can see here, this is their main waste product, but they also print the boards first. So it means that if they make a printing error, if the print kind of hangs off the side or something like that, they also have boards that are not cut, but are printed, and they're also waste products. And so we thought, okay, there we go. We have a lower number of chairs, but we can put legs on these. They have a pretty interesting underside. And this is how it works in the end. So you have the kind of sucked-in state for the dance party, and the bottom rung of the chairs is kind of opened up for the various other conditions, so you can go back and forth between these. For the steel structure, we initially thought we have to use Thomas trusses, something like that, which is a kind of structure that you're familiar with from concert venues and temporary structures like that. We thought, wouldn't it be great to have something like this, a custom steel structure, but we could never afford it. Until we talked to Banker Steel, who said, we have all of this 4x4 by a quarter steel in our yard, and if you can engineer this thing to use this steel, then we will give it to you for free, and we'll also give you a discount on the fabrication costs. So, of course, we said yes. And then we have these two systems going on. There's the skin, which is this kind of existing loop from Comet, and the existing recycling of the steel, and just borrowing as we had intended, and elongating those processes, and then giving back to the system. So the system works in 3 parts: the skin, the structure, and also a certain amount of borrowing and reuse in the wood decks and the pools at the bottom. So this is the plan, a straight line at the top, all the way across here to a final pool, which was the hinge point for this church courtyard. And then at the bottom you can see this the stepping back and forth of the pools, and also the reaching out of those stages into the various different courtyards. So this is what we presented at the competition submission, a few different models, including an urban model, and we won. This is some sort of sign language for oh no, because then we had to make this happen, which meant we're talking about 3,000 pieces, offcut pieces of skateboards here, and a very short construction time. So what we needed to do was to panelize these, to go from 3,000 pieces to 150 panels, which we did in something that we called Skateboard Saturdays, to make it more attractive to the Cornell students who came every Saturday and wove some of these panels together to produce all of the pieces. That was happening every Saturday from January until June, and Comet was working very hard to keep up with us. Also working on the steel details to make it work in relation to the skateboard increments and the benches at the bottom. Also this kind of bladder structure which acted in place of significant foundations to hold the system down. Pre-drilling the holes as part of the fabrication of the steel, pre-drilling the holes which would engage with the skateboard panels themselves. This is a drawing of the water bladders. Steel details, just one of the letters. We had Peter Eisenman test all the benches. And we also had Emiko, who we originally wanted to give us the chairs. They agreed to make legs for us because the original legs were quite laborious and also very heavy. So Emiko provided the legs of the benches. The water system, I won't go into, the lighting system, the ground screws, which were 7 feet tall screws in the ground. And finally, we finished the panels with much joy and laid them out in Ithaca and trucked them down to Long Island City, where the steel was going up, the bladders were going in. And this is the panels going in on site. You can see a simple plywood strip on the top, and then the panels are kind of overlaid slightly with a kind of lip to allow a kind of sense of or not a sense of panelization, but a sense of continuity. The shadows that started to be created by those panels. And then in the attic of PS1, the legs going on the benches. And I have to take a moment here to say that this project was only made possible by many, many volunteers from Cornell, either students or former students, some of whom are in the audience. This is a picture of Nathan, who's in the audience. June is here, and Ashley is here, and I don't know if anyone else is, but some of these people who helped on the project are hanging around in these parts these days. We had a lot of problems because the materials that we were using, namely skateboards, were not being used in the way that they were intended to be used. And they also hadn't been finished in the way that Comet would have finished them had they been continuing on in the process of skateboard manufacturing. So they had a lot of issues of buckling in the water. And we also had issues, last-minute issues, where the footings that we had created for the benches didn't fit when we got on site. We solved the problems by a magnet, which in the end just clipped simply onto the steel frame. And then these little guys, which became really important in the project and really materialized only in the last week, they're called soft trucks, and they're the kind of accessories that skateboarders use when they want to try out a trick, but they're not quite ready. So they're not ready for wheels, but they have these kind of things that are called soft trucks. And these are actually also kind of a waste product themselves, because the manufacturer, some guy in his garage in New Jersey had, in the kind of original making of these things, had made them too hard, not bouncy enough, and he had 80 sets of these in his garage that were just hanging around because they couldn't be used for real skateboards. So we also persuaded him to give us those. This is one moment where the skateboard benches rise up from that kind of baseline over what we call the cinema screen. This is the back of the screen with the legs coming through. And the idea is that you take all of those benches off at the moment that you want to watch a film, and then the film screen is revealed. So this is the final day. And if you didn't notice already, one of the underlying ideas here is that this thing, it should look like it says something, but it shouldn't be quite clear what it says. You should think maybe it says something in Cyrillic or some other alphabet that I'm not familiar with, but in the end it says wall, but only as a shadow, so you won't, you might be provoked into asking the question, but the answer won't be given by an investigation of the object itself. This is the lighting at nighttime, and also the projection of the light through the facade onto the walls of the PS1 museum. We had proposed, and part of the title that I explained is this thing for multiple uses, so not just a pool party and the dance party, but dining, discussion, wedding, lectures, and various things. And indeed, those things did happen. This is one of the pool party scenes, and people seem to know what to do. And we did also have a wedding. This is the project leader and a project team member who got married for real. I didn't force them to do that. And many of the other kind of planned uses. And then there are many unplanned uses, which is this kind of playfulness enabled by the soft trucks themselves, the kind of a different kind of lounging than we had expected, and so on. And of course, people knew how to party, and party, and party. And so I think one of the big ideas that we had, and I think lots of people have come at this project in different ways, but I think for us we were quite excited about this architectural position, let's say, somewhere between the sign or the billboard as it exists in Long Island City as an advertising message that is super clear. You're not in any doubt what you're being sold, versus the architectural sign, which is more difficult and more abstract, and we're interested in playing a little bit between that space, not necessarily wanting to give answers, but to hopefully start a kind of provocation, saying, what is this thing saying to me? And I think in the end, and maybe this is not planned, but maybe in the best case scenario, it happens too at the scale of the smaller increments. So I think when one first looks at this, maybe it seems like a kind of lacy facade, something maybe produced in this digital world that we're familiar with, and only upon closer inspection, looking at maybe the details, and especially looking at the underside of the benches, which when they're in their upright position are kind of on the interior of the structure, maybe one then starts to figure out that this facade has another life, or had another life before it was part of this facade. And so maybe in the end what we're doing is not so much, or what's important about what we did is not so much that we used these recycled or skateboard offcuts, but hopefully that we provoked an idea that that materials or architectural materials or facade materials might be opened up, and we might be able to think that other things other than what we are used to using might have a life in our future designs. Thank you.
Well, good night. Thank you for staying here. I mean, the last 3 years I've been the last speaker, having previously a wonderful chef, and I see it in your faces. Be brief. I mean, we are hungry, so don't worry. Well, I'm bringing 3 built recycling plants that we had the opportunity to construct in a very short period of time in Madrid and Barcelona, and that we considered that were interesting for us because, first of all, there were clear opportunities to construct in, let's say, big-scale containers, and also to test some ideas on what's the role of recycling. More than just using materials. We thought that it was about recycling fragments of the cities that we were intervening. And this is the first one that we won a huge European competition. Just because I will explain it, we added a kind of public facility, I mean, a way to visit it, and it became a kind of incredible success and is still a success in Madrid. It was in those days the largest in Europe. It's for the garbage, domestic garbage of Madrid. I mean, these are competitions that are made for 25 years of use, and then the industrial, the construction, the container has to be dismantled or recycled. So every part of has to be deconstructed, so the joints have to be physical, not chemical, or reuse and recycle. And as in this case, we were in the limits of a so-called regional park, which is a very entropic landscape, but the city is growing. The first circle is the Retiro Park in the center. From the moment we began the project till now, the city of Madrid is now 1.5 kilometers at the distance, and as you see, the landscape is basically very destroyed by time and also by people dumping there whatever in many years. We decided to produce this collage, because it was a collage in those days, that show clearly what our intentions with these constructions. It was basically to mimic the wavy slopes of the landscape and use the slopes to create a kind of artificial slope that had some references in many of the landscapers of painters of Madrid that had always focused in these entropic landscapes, but also had the idea of establishing like three parallel activities. One is the topography that was terraced in like 3-4 volumes. Then the whole selection and garbage process was using the gravitational forces to separate different plastics through weight, and so it was very useful in order to save some money. And the other thing was the architectural. No? So in the topography, in the machinery, and in the architectural, we established a kind of very simple and simplistic way to manage these things. You can see this catwalk. The catwalk is the only thing we added. Instead of having a 1.5 meter catwalk for workers from the dressing room to their positions, we just expanded it to 3.5 meters. And then the institutions like schools and a lot of institutions in Madrid visit every year this, and it's a wonderful day for the students. I remember when I was a student, I had to go to the Coca-Cola factory, and now my daughter had to go there. But they enjoy a lot because it's really a spectacle to see all what you have been eating during your breakfast now, running in this kind of travelators and so on. So. For the roof, we recycled the very materials that we were testing. Basically, the roof was made with broken bricks to maintain the humidity, and with compost that was tested, and then planted with sedum plants that don't need that much, and also don't bring parasites, because the humidity is very low. And this also is the only insulation. I mean, basically these are it's like a cap. I mean, the structure is very simple. It's naturally ventilated, naturally lighted, and with these skylights that you have seen in the section. And then this insulation is the only way to buffer a little bit the heat gains through radiation. Other thing that we added in this project was to put together the so-called white-collar and blue-collar people. I mean, they used to have a kind of chalet 2 kilometers away, the white, while the blue deal with the garbage. And in this case, we put them together and created a patio. I don't know if you see it. I don't know where is the... Is this the... Oh, no. It's not this. Yeah. It's going back, sorry. And well, there is a patio there, and you will see it. And we created some offices. Yeah, and then the construction is made with basically a prefabricated structure of a steel structure and polycarbonate. You see here some fragments. The thing with the polycarbonate was strange because we wanted to use recycled polycarbonate, and every factory in Europe was very reluctant. We had to travel like 5 times to Frankfurt, spending a lot of money in this to convince the directors, and finally we were happy to obtain the polycarbonate, the recycled polycarbonate, at the same price that the new one. It was. But this is the patio I was mentioning. I mean, you see the polycarbonate and you see the simplicity. The patio is paved with the deconstruction of the ingredients of the roof, and there are like very few elements here, and this kind of ramp to the roof is unifying the place where the people visiting, which is to the left, have a kind of so-called museum of garbage where they experiment and they create some tools and some things with some leftovers of the recycling plant, and then they go up to the roof, see the whole neighborhood, and then they go inside the plant. No, this is the visit. Here you see these photographs are when we were almost finished. You see the brick. I'm not going to explain how it is processed because it's too long. This is the whole. The upper part is the compost. And this is the T gate. This is a very important part because it's the gate of these areas, because the trucks come full and go empty, and the difference of weight is transformed in euros, and that's it. I mean, the business is this one. No? But we wanted to create something that was at the scale of this kind of anthropic or, in a way, sublime landscape, and created this radical shape that mimics a little bit the John Hancock plant of here in Boston, having this shift, and creates very strange geometries in it. The second one is close to, is in Madrid again. This is not for the garbage of Madrid, this is for the garbage of the metropolitan area of Madrid. And it's 15 kilometers south of, in the same regional park, south of the previous one, but this, the landscape is completely different. This is a kind of idyllic, very, very abstract, without any treatment of human beings for centuries. And the only thing, and very flat, and the only thing we had was a kind of small hill. In fact, the commission came from the losers of the previous competition, so we had to win this too. And this is what we made. In the small hill, in the first the figure here, we made all the access for the public, and then in the other side that is almost invisible, we transformed the sloped roof into a kind of set of terraced roofs that go cascade down to reach the level of the lower part of the park. So it's a construction of plateaus that mimics the plateaus that are surrounding this area, no? And the process is completely different, but this geometry that we tested in this case allow us to make a different way to make it public, because you could go up and down and you could move from outside to inside and see at the same time the recycling plant and the landscape. In this case, they use other system. They extract first the methane and then they dump into the garbage. And these are the images of the roof, and you see the whole volume. So using this technique, we could adapt to the height of the machinery in each case, and at the same time introduce some natural light without any kind of complication. and create this kind of nice relationship with the site. The third one and the last one is in Barcelona. Was a product of another international competition for the Forum area. That the first plan was drawn by Acevillo and Enric Miralles, and they, I mean, the whole area is full of let's say, singular buildings, but we wanted to go to the last corner of the city, completely abandoning in time, and that had no plans at all. I mean, it was a kind of leftover. No one knew what to do with it. If you just trace a line from the diagonal, you just get exactly the diagonal that crosses the city. You just arrive to our place. So, and the place is completely full of leftovers, as I said. I mean, in fact, it was called in those days Chernobyl in Barcelona, and it's very close to one of the poorest neighborhoods that you have in Barcelona, and at the same time, it was completely polluted, and the soil, everything. When we wanted to come here, we asked Acevillo and the people of Barcelona what other things, instead of trying to neglect, I mean, or to reject all this stuff, what other things they were having difficulties to locate in the city, to add more complexity, and they said us. That they didn't know how to locate a water tank for storms, heating and cooling system for the neighborhood, a pneumatic garbage collecting system, and another thing I don't remember. So we added all these things, and we asked them if they were in favor of having more beaches. And they said that it was possible because of the regime of winds and the sea. So we added a beach and all these ingredients and traced a kind of collage of elements that instead of trying to unify them, what we created was a kind of composition of 4 or 5 different elements of the same scale that could behave as a whole thing without needing to be similar or with the same function. This is the drawing. And we added some ornament, or a lot of ornament, to the pavements in order to capture the interest of the local, the neighborhoods, and to make them understand that it was a kind of design. Very basic. I mean, the mall in front of the beach is just the reproduction of fishes of a calendar I had in my kitchen, no? This kind of lentil system came directly from a CD of Beck that was sounding in this moment in the studio, and so on. And this is the way. I mean, instead of trying to hide completely the incinerator that originally was there, it was transformed into a recycling plant. We tried to give a kind of new face, but immediately after that, you had all the stuff. But from the city, the views, you had this kind of blue thing that is showing the direction to the sea, because we were recovering as a public space this area, and then it creates a kind of collage of different things. The first row, I mean, here in the first plan, you see the green slope that hides all the things. This is the image that hides all we call it the green submarine, and it's a kind of mountain, of slope that protects from the noise of the highway, but at the same time makes visible the sea from the last corner of the park, and has all this stuff stacked in several floors, and creates a kind of the volume is created just functionally and in a kind of random way, I would say. And the recycling plant is the other side of the entrance to the park, and at the same time is trying to hide a little bit the incinerator, which was painted black. So in this case, we fragmented the volume in order to create the elements that combined it, created a kind of stroll or a way to enter into the park that could be interesting and natural. and use this combination that of let's say green roofs and polycarbonate that we were interested in reinforcing, because it was a kind of hybrid materiality. I mean, it was not completely natural, it was not completely artificial, and this kind of ambiguity was interesting for us. And the park, which was originally the motif, I mean, the leitmotif of the competition. We use some techniques with concrete, completely conventional concrete colored pavement, decomposing it through different processes and creating this pattern that is completely visible, and depending on the scale you look at it, it's completely abstract or completely figurative. And these benches were another outcome of this project. Here we have Beck CD, and the benches were another invention to fulfill. I mean, the budget for the park was ridiculous, so there were like many places that had no any kind of a specific identity, and we created a bench that could define a place by itself. It's composed of a series of 5 pieces that that can be combined in many different ways. Or I don't know if they are erotic or eschatologic, but it's in between both things. And this was the intention, this ambiguity. And this instead of having vast relief, to having a kind of relief that forces us to some innovative parametric tools and scaffolding methods, etc., and that gave way to a wonderful place for the neighbors that in reality were our clients in this case. So I think that in many ways recycling is an opportunity to create innovative spaces and new ideas on public space. Thank you so much.
So we've already had a very full discussion, but I did have one or two I don't know, provocations or thoughts, especially around this question of the relationship again between system and artifact. And in this session, we were talking very particularly about artifacts which have been sort of produced in a way, I think about Nick's video and the sort of partition of this carcass. Essentially, many of these artifacts were in effect created from detritus or that sort of partition, that awful in a way. But I was curious, actually. It was also interesting, particularly to hear, Iñaki and Caroline's attempts to reclaim materials and like those attempts being frustrated. And I was really actually curious to what extent you discovered opportunities for sort of systemic improvement in the use of those types of materials, which are just sort of totally neglected. I mean, it feels in a way like our deliberate understanding of the life cycle of materials sort of ends at a certain point, and there aren't conventional ways to even to monetize, let alone sort of distribute that sort of waste. So I was curious, in your investigations, what were the opportunities for enhancing those types of systems?
Well,
I think it's important that I'm talking about temporary structures, and Iñaki's talking about things that should last for a long time. And I don't know how the material that I am talking about and similar siblings of those materials would work, because they're not guaranteed for a 30-year or a 50-year lifespan. And certainly the skateboards, even though they everyone expects them to have a certain kind of toughness because they're jumped on and they're played with, in the state that we were working with them, they really degenerated very quickly. They kind of aged. They actually got wrinkles during their lifespan, and we wondered how one would think about using that if, let's say, if that structure, if MoMA said, let's keep this up for a year, we would have had a problem because there's no way of knowing that the skateboards would survive for that length of time. And I think once you kind of extrapolate the use of recycled materials into, let's say, real architecture or not temporary architecture, you automatically run into those kinds of problems.
Or peaks. No? I think that what unifies our presentation is the extreme use of all the materials and that are involved, being the peak or being the products of the recycling plant and or being the skateboard. And I think that this fits quite well with what Mohsen said at the beginning on the idea of Hungarian waste. No? That this is not about a kind of sustainable or moralist thing. Is the need of really using at maximum all the ingredients that you have at hand and trying to obtain some creativity from the constraints that these materials offer to you. No? I think that this is quite important. No?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, particularly from I think I'm sort of like the de facto proxy for certain aspects of Frank's position here, but it was interesting to sort of think about the artifactual result of those processes and sort of compare it to this sort of extreme embedding of downstream logics in order to reduce waste. And it was I wondered actually if some of the logics that are sort of implicit in this in these offcuts might find a way to might find a sort of like encapsulated form that would allow them to be reused in a more effective way. I mean, in a way, I don't know. It's a little bit of a dreamy ambition, but there must be a way to sort of like categorize, classify, and sort of taxonomize those wastes in a way that they can be used opportunistically much more effectively. Because that was one of the striking things in a way about your project, was the extent to which the final product was actually super opportunistic. I'm not sure how we're doing on time, but I would like to open it up for questions if there are observations or.
Yeah, there's one question there.
Nick mentioned the term moving the needle from perception to awareness. And I'm interested in the shifts social behavior changes are the most difficult, but even professional changes in behavior. Do you think that in terms of the projects, the architecture projects that you two showed, are you thinking that the biggest assets are at the levels of perception? In other words, as Nick said, make it look beautiful, or at the level of awareness of creating a sort of, if not a paradigm change, but at least a different way of approaching?
I think my main concern was what would happen 25 years after. Because in the three cases, the relationship among the city or the natural and the artificial part of the city was going to change. And the idea of dismantling didn't sound me like really useful. So the idea of having a big container, a big container, and in the edge of a park is a situation that we all know that happens from the Metropolitan in the Central Park to La Villette in the Academy of the Music, was it? I don't remember. No, the Landscape School. I mean, in La Villette. What was in a moment this. Yeah, it was music later, and I think that the idea of which tools do we use to make these volumes reusable, how much you contain your needness of adaptation to one specific program, and try to establish a dialogue with the site, with the topography, etc. Was for me the most relevant thing. It's a kind of, I don't know if it is awareness, but it's a way to think in time instead of thinking in material only?
I would be reluctant to choose either of the two options that you gave. Making it look beautiful, I hope that we never thought of that as a possibility. The other one, raising awareness, I guess it's not an either-or situation, is what I'm trying to say. I think what we were hoping for is a kind of provocation of a thought, which might eventually lead to awareness, but it might not. It might just give you the feeling that something is not what you thought it was, but that's what we were really interested in. I think it could be dangerous to go into this hoping that awareness would be the end result. It could be a side effect. And I have no idea, but it might be the same when we think about it in terms of cooking, that it might be about it tasting good, but it's also about starting the mind of the consumer, the eater, thinking about what is this and where does it come from, potentially.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is. One of the things that we do at the restaurant is we talk to our staff on a regular basis about where these things are coming from, so they're well informed when a guest tastes something and they can convey a story. One of the people that we buy pigs from, for example, is this guy, Patrick Martins, who runs an organization called Heritage Foods, and what he's made our staff aware of is that his organization is basically creating it's a luxury product. I mean, no two ways about it. These are expensive pigs, they're expensive turkeys, whatever he's going after. What he's really trying to do, and it's a lofty goal, is to preserve certain ancient breeds from going extinct, because a lot of these breeds are going extinct because what we've done in the U.S. is breed, crossbreed all these animals to create like the Arnold Schwarzenegger chickens and pigs and cows of the world, that they grow faster, they get fatter, and what they actually do is they artificially inseminate these animals so that you're basically picking the sickest chicken out of the lot, the one that is really top heavy and big breasted and is like has bad joints, and you're creating the uber chicken. And so what we try to do is although we don't tell this entire story table side because it would not be a good antipasto to your meal, but they're aware of the fact that we are, in fact, by buying these pigs that probably couldn't be sold at a supermarket because the price would be too high, but by buying them, we're actually sustaining a whole system of farmers that are actually doing something the right way. And a lot of these farmers were going out of business because people would not buy their pigs. And then when a farm, goes out of business, it doesn't turn into another farm, it turns into something else. And so, the permanency of it is sort of sustaining that farm, that agriculture.
Thank you. I really appreciated all the presentations, and I want to address Nicholas's. When you spoke about this Quinto Quarto and the idea of the rebirth of traditional Roman cooking, that is, in a way, to use everything that you have because it was the most economical way, it really reminded me of beginning as a 24-year-old back in Iran, when we were into the same situation, but architecturally, to take the traditional way people were building, because it was much more economical, it was much more efficient, what was available. And I wonder, you now run a very modern business, but that's your thought process, is what did I learn from those traditions? I wonder if we could take that same and apply it to architecture. Of course, you applied it to the skateboard, but in a way, we've thrown away the traditional materials and the traditional way of building these days, architecturally, in many ways, for various reasons, but they're really very economical. And I wonder if we could have some comment about how tradition can be reused today, because it is environmentally sustainable. People were doing it because they had to be self-sufficient. But we don't do those too much anymore. Thank you.
I think that there is an important thing is to understand that there is a kind of vernacular modernist architecture too. I mean, when you use this kind of thin, cheap materials and you are using exactly the same that people were using when they were fabricating houses with adobe or other materials. I mean, these are now the cheapest that you can find in the market. And I want to make a loop and come back to the reasons of Gehry to be interested in this. If you, I mean, we all think about titanium, but we know, I mean, if we look at his first houses in LA and we look at his house, etc., it was really, really a bricolage with the cheapest materials. And then they have expanded in scale and quality and other things, but the whole inspiration comes from the cheapest. And this kind of vernacular modernism that I think is a crucial aspect. Many times we forget that this is also part of the history. This is my response.
I think maybe the Romans are very smart with their food, but also, you know, there's this tradition of using the ancient columns, the spolia in their Renaissance buildings, and presumably that's not for financial reasons. Presumably that's to kind of honor the tradition, or to respect, or to get back the ideas that were kind of tumbled down. So maybe it's a Roman thing.
I mean, I can only speak to the food side of things, but it's a conversation we have every single day, and I think my sous chefs kind of hate me for it because I keep drilling it home to them. It's like, how would they do this in old Rome? And they're like, and they keep saying, Nick, who cares? It's like, we want to cook. We got to get the menus printed. Let's go. And but it's a good tension to have, because the way the conversations go is I think it really forces creativity, because they don't want to just recreate old dishes. These are very proud chefs with a really high skill set, and they want to create new things. And so I'm like, great, let's create new things, but let's make sure that we're using everything and that we're attacking it the exact same way, with the same mindset that they would have attacked, you know, a pig back in the day. So don't let anything go to waste. So like, find a way to use, like, pork liver is pretty disgusting. If anybody's eaten sauteed pork liver just straight up, it's not a fun ingredient to work with. But you know, you figure out a way to grind it with some pork belly, spike it with sage and parsley and garlic, and you know, steam it in a terrine mold and spread it on crusty bread and serve it with a pickled turnip. Now it's pretty good, and you know, so
it's a good way to finish.
Yeah. So use tradition, but reinvent it.
I mean, I think it's also true that the sort of culture in which we're embedded, for example, the culture, I mean, Ranya's presentation I thought was really fascinating for this sort of extended geography of I mean, we're no longer in a culture that's analogous in many ways to that traditional culture. So perforce, just this simple dictum to reuse everything is something that requires a new level of invention and will never be exactly what it was, but in fact creates a new situation entirely.
I think that's it. Huh? It's enough.
Can I just thank all of you for your perseverance? This was like a whole day's thing that was compacted into one evening, and it's really wonderful that you stayed. Thank you very much to all the panelists. This event would not have been possible without Chantal Blakely, and she has done an incredible job getting everybody here. And she's also arranged cookies for all of you with milk so that you can just straight go to sleep after this. So, so please partake of the cookies. And once again, thank you very much to all the speakers, moderators, for really an enjoyable evening. Thank you.